Today we are joined by director, writer, and producer Michael Dahan. Michael is an Israel-American scholar, filmmaker, and artist. He earned his MFA in studio arts with a critical theory emphasis from UC Irvine. His current work explores how the histories of families connected to both victims of the Nakba and those involved in it continue to echo across generations. His previous experimental film, 2 Points of Failure, has screened at major festivals including Edinburgh, Melbourne, and Tribeca Film Festival, to name a few. Before all of that, he also spent a decade working as a film executive. I am very excited to talk about his new film, Yes, Repeat, No, which is available to rent on all major platforms, including Amazon, Apple TV, and you can also buy it on DVD. Michael, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I had the pleasure to watch this movie last week. Thought it was phenomenal, and I'm excited to talk to you today about it. I'll read a little blurb about it for the listeners at home who haven't seen it yet. Yes, Repeat, No explores the complexities of the overlapping identities of Juliano Mer-Khamis, a Palestinian Jew who was assassinated at the steps of his theater he founded in Jenin. Juliano considered himself a living embodiment of the Palestine-Israel conflict, born to an anti-Zionist Jewish mother and a Palestinian Christian communist father. Juliano became an internationally acclaimed actor who appeared in films including The Little Drummer Girl, Mural, and later became a director, theater founder, and political activist. He considered himself a living embodiment of the Palestine-Israel conflict through code switching between the conflicting identities he inhabited. Juliano understood he was always viewed as an Arab in Israel and a Jew in Jenin. Yes, Repeat, No asks whether it is remembering our past or instead forgetting it that allows us to break cycles of identity and conflict. When I got done watching this film, the first thing I did was read all of Juliano's Wikipedia page, because I think, you touch on it, but it's a very interesting life that the man lives. And so I was just super interested to kind of read all about it.
The film isn't really a biography of Juliano, but we definitely use a lot of, information and events from his life. Right.
Yeah.
It specifically isn't a biopic, right? Like it's kind of magical allegory, right? It's not really. It's like a poetic interpretation.
Yeah, for sure. There's, for people who haven't seen it yet, there's basically 3 actors who are in the middle of an audition about playing Juliano in an experimental film of sorts, without giving anything away. I'm curious, what first drew you to Juliano's life, knowing that like this is the next film I wanted to make?
Well, I just think who he is, just to begin with, right? As having Palestinian father and a Jewish mother, just that is really interesting. So just knowing who he was and what he represented as a human being, I thought was really had a lot of potential. But then I, like you and many others who find out about him, I did a bunch of research, and I found out that I found this video that we use in the film, where he kind of in a joking way predicts his own murder. He says, I'll tell you how I'm going to die. Some effed up Palestinian is going to shoot me in the head. And I didn't think much of that video itself until I also read that that's actually what happened, right? And as soon as I had those 2 things right there, I was like, there's got to be a movie here somewhere. I knew people who had worked with his theater company, the Freedom Theater Company, which is still around in Jenin, right? And it was a really interesting project because this Juliano started out as an actor himself, and I think was often frustrated by the kind of parts that were available to him as an actor, Middle Eastern man in the 1980s and 90s, right? Because there's a very limited scope of roles that you could actually have, and many of them are the kind of parts that we use in the film itself, which is like jihadi number 2 or warlord or terrorist, right? And that's why he starts this theater company, because he wants to show Palestinian teenagers and kids that there's a different way to deal with trauma besides violence, and that somehow, engaging in kind of cultural activism was an alternative. But by the very fact of what he's doing, putting boys and girls on stage together, having them kiss, having boys dress as women, which, in the theater is not a radical thing to do. It's kind of been part of tradition of theater and its history for a very long time. But those were kind of scandalous things. So there were a lot of people in the community in Jenin, who had reasons to be very upset about that culturally. And it's not like a Palestinian. We don't know if a Palestinian person assassinated him. It's not really known, but it's understood that there were people on both sides, meaning Palestinians and Israelis, who had reasons. Palestinians thought he was probably a spy for the Israelis, and the Israelis thought he was collaborating with terrorists. So anybody could have killed him. And that's what was really interesting, is that he was offensive to all sides, while also being, trying to bridge the divide between those sides.
Yeah. I mean, came through during watching the film, but very interesting how he was kind of caught in no man's land, essentially.
As a human, he didn't, how he defined himself changed based on where he was. He defined himself as an Arab in Jenin, but he could also define himself as an Israeli. And I think that's what's interesting to me, is the way in which identity is this thing that we're constantly negotiating and constructing and figuring out situation to situation. We're all different people in different situations. I'm a different person with my kids than I am with my students, different person with my wife than I am with, my friends. So it's like, I was really interested in that, especially because people are so attached to their identities and the politics around their identities, and they make it seem as if those identities are so hardened and almost permanent, when in reality they're quite fluid and they change.
Yeah, and in the blurb I read about, the code switching that he would do, how did that impact the way that you told this story at all, knowing that he was code switching in his actual life? Did it change the way that you wrote the story, the way that the film's edited?
For sure. That was the point. I mean, it's kind of the point of it, right? Is that the premise of the movie narratively is just these three actors who show up and audition to play Juliano, right? So it's kind of meta-cinematic. It's about actors auditioning to play him in a conceptual film, but it is itself a conceptual film about these actors. And the kind of contest of this audition is that they each think that they get the part, but each one of them represents like a different side of Juliano. So there's one that's the Israeli Juliano, who is arguing that Juliano was an Israeli. And it's based on the parts that he played as an Israeli. He played a lot of IDF soldiers. He himself was a paratrooper in the IDF, the Israeli, the Defense Force. But then there's another actor who is actually a Palestinian actor who, makes the argument that no, he's more Palestinian than anything else, and that's also based on a bunch of parts that he played as a Palestinian. And then there's this third actor who's somewhere in between. He's like the public Juliano, which is just the almost like a character that Juliano played in the public sphere, as an activist. And so the contest is like, well, which one of us is authentically Juliano? And it becomes this kind of argument and fight, which is really, kind of uncovers this argument and fight about like, who's right, Palestinians or Israelis. Like I wanted to make a movie about this conflict without being heavy-handed about the conflict. And so it became much easier to tell it through like three actors auditioning and competing with each other, which I think is a lot easier to understand for people who don't really want to dive into this conflict in a way that might be overwhelming, because it can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
So the fact that he didn't have, that his identity was kind of fluid and conflicted and contradictory, I think is the point of the movie. We wanted to kind of lean into that without, offering you an answer about like, well, which one is the most Juliano?
The tone of this movie does a great job of not hitting you over the head like, this is what I believe and this is what you should believe. And I think it does a great job of asking a lot of questions without giving answers and giving the viewers something to chew on and to like reflect on. And I can see why Juliano was the perfect person to kind of vehicle to kind of tell this story. I'm curious, like during the process, were you very conscious of getting this tone right, or is it something that kind of happened organically?
No, I mean, I think obviously a lot of it developed as we were doing it because this is a very experimental kind of fluid production process. But for me, the big question is I'm Israeli. I've lived in the United States for probably almost 4 decades. So I have an emotional attachment to Israel that's undeniable. I was born there. My family is there. My extended family's there. My grandfather was a rabbi. I'm proud of my Judaism. But as a person who hasn't lived there for 40 years, even though I've gone back quite a bit, I'm troubled by the things that are happening. And so I'm conflicted, like I simultaneously believe that Israel deserves to exist undeniably, but also that Palestinians deserve to have their own, autonomous and independent existence as a nation themselves. So I'm really offended when Israelis get taken hostage and killed, but I'm also equally offended by the fact that, thousands, tens of thousands, 20, 30, 50, who knows what the actual number is of Palestinians that have been displaced and killed. So all of those things are troubling to me, and they're kind of contradictory. So then, how do I make a movie about this region of the world that is so personal to me if it's hard for me to negotiate between like who is more right? So then I just decided to lean into the fact that like what this movie is going to be about is not having an answer about that contradiction and just trying to present the contradiction in a way that makes people feel how difficult it is and complex it really is. I think that people who ultimately take sides in conflicts like this or attach themselves too much to one version of an identity or another are doing it because they can eliminate and reduce and almost erase a lot of things about the other side that helps them feel like they're right. And so when you give people all of the information and all of its complexity and nuance, I think what happens is it's impossible for them to declare who is right and who is wrong. It becomes much more difficult. And to me, that was a much more honest way to make a movie, because that's actually what I experience. I reject anybody who says that that's not a viable position. There's a lot of people who are like, well, you've got to pick a side, right? You can't be for this and for that. You can't be against, the killing of these people, but also against the killing of these people. It's like, well, why not? That's actually, I think it's more reasonable. And I think more people believe that than not.
Yeah, it was very interesting to watch, like the actors, the actors in the film itself grappling with the identity of Juliano, and those debates that they had.
Those aren't all scripted, right? Because those are actually things that they're experiencing, and we're just filming it.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you, the production of this movie is. I was sitting there, and I'm like, where does the movie itself end? And like, where is it? Almost felt a lot of like behind the scenes footage almost. What was it improv? How much of that was written down? How much of that was deliberate? And how much of that was just organic?
Well, I mean, it's a script. There's a script. There's we started with an 80-page script, but a lot of stuff is improvised between the actors. One of the things that we set out to do from the very beginning, the producers I was working with and I, Braxton Pope and Sarah Salovitz, both really amazing people that I got to work with. One of the things that we set out to do was cast not just actors, but people who actually had, a biographical attachment to this world and to this area, so that it wasn't just what we had written on the page, but that they could bring something to the process. And we knew that you can't make a movie about Palestine and Israel without expecting that people are going to have differences of opinion. Adam Meir, who is the public Juliano, who plays public Juliano, is himself Israeli. Kareem, who is the Israeli Juliano, he's Lebanese, right? And Musa is Palestinian. Salome Azizi, who plays the director, is British Iranian. So everybody had their own opinions, and we didn't always agree. So the point was like, how do we set up a production process that allows us to be able to have experimentation, figure out what the work is about. And even when we're speaking off camera or offset, that itself becomes part of the movie. And so that was one of the problems that we had to solve, was like, okay, we want to have multiple cameras going continuously for as long as we're shooting every day, which is roughly around 6 hours a day for an 8-hour day, right? So we did 10 of those days on the stage. But I had 4 cameras, 3 of them on dolly tracks, one of them sometimes on a jib, another BTS camera or 2. So it's like sometimes 5, sometimes 6 cameras. And I told the camera crew, listen, if I say cut for the actors, that's for the actors. That means we're not like performing. But that doesn't mean you stop shooting. So there were times, because we're going to stop and argue, and we're not going to always agree, but that's interesting. So in a way, it was really important what they brought to it, right? Adam Meir, didn't always agree with the things that we were saying about Israel, and pushed back, and that was great because we wanted it to feel like a kind of even-handed contest that was kind of balanced. And so that became part of, so part of the pre-production process was like, how do you set yourself up so that whenever those things happen, you can make them part of the film. It made editing really difficult. We came out of this 10 days with 250 hours of footage. So
geez.
we can talk about that process, right? But
Yeah.
it also made it possible that, you couldn't really control the outcome of every day. It was just like, well, whatever happens in front of the cameras today is what happens in the movie. Right. There's no way to cheat that just because the script is the script. So the script was like a jumping off point, and then conversations happened and discussions happened. And then we would script in some other lines that people would, we put, Sarah Salovitz had this brilliant idea to put a bunch of lines from political leaders around on V flats, which you can actually see in the film. And we told the actors, like, hey, if you see a line that you think is interesting because Yasser Arafat said it, or Benjamin Netanyahu said it, or Mahmoud Abbas said it, you just put it in. Don't tell us when you're going to do it. Let's just see how it goes. So, there was a script, and then there was a production process, and it was really additive. The process was very additive during production. We added a lot. It got more complex and layered, and I could never have scripted a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, that's super cool and super interesting. So it was almost like you made a documentary of behind the scene footage, and then you splice it into.
Yeah, it's like a documentary of a making of a film. It's like we actually did make a film, but we also made a documentary of the film while we were doing it. And in the production schedule, the first week was supposed to be, okay, we're going to rehearse. And the second week was supposed to be, okay, now we're going to actually do it for real. But honestly, like it's not like whether you're watching a rehearsal or the actual production. We just kept doing the script in 20-page, let's say, increments, and filming it, and then had to figure out a way to piece it together after the fact, right? So it's not like it wasn't shot even in the conventional way of like, okay, this was, part of the process of filmmaking that frustrates me sometimes is like, okay, we're going to do a shot, you're going to say the line, we're going to push in, and then we're going to reset, relight, go over the shoulder, then, you'll do the other line and you'll do the response. And then after that, we reset. It's like, there's no flow to that process. It's so we wanted to create a situation where we could just keep shooting and shoot in like 25-minute takes, sometimes 40-minute takes. Sometimes really long takes, because then you kind of get into a rhythm and people start to figure stuff out. So that was another kind of problem of pre-production, was setting it up so we could just keep shooting and have really long takes and never run out of a card on all cameras at the same time, and always be staggered so that you could always get something and do all of the coverage at the same time. One camera was on close up, one camera was a medium shot, one camera was on a track doing, full shots. So it's like, how do you get all of it at the same time without interrupting what's happening with the actors? So a lot of like production problems to solve to get us to that place.
Yeah. Very interesting. It almost felt like a play at times.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. The way
they're on a stage. I really like the way that people rehearse plays. Like so much of it is spent in, so much of the time when you're doing a play is spent in rehearsal, and you really figure out what the script is, even though you think you know what it is when you go in. And I think that's something that has always been interesting to me, is trying to still do that even in filmmaking. Like I kind of never want to shoot another film that's not like this, where I just let the actors go.
Yeah. Was there anything in your so far in your film career that led up to this point that prepared you for this, or was it all pretty much just experimental and we're kind of
No,
figuring out day by
I think
day?
a lot of stuff. I mean, I think I think having a background, listen, I worked in, a kind of the big film studio system for 10 years before I went back to art school and got a master's in fine art. So it's like, I really love movies and I love big movies and I love I worked on big historical movies and stuff like that. So, um, I really like the Hollywood system. I just didn't, it wasn't a way that I wanted to be making films for the rest of my life. So I went to art school and I started working very experimentally. And the kind of experimental process is less about giving you an answer and making you feel something specific. And it's more about a process that is open-ended and kind of challenges the viewer to come to their own conclusion. So somewhere in between those two things was what I was trying to do, because I wanted to still appeal to people, but with really interesting and deep, complex ideas, right? So I'd say my interest in film as a kind of filmmaker or an executive in Hollywood is just about like, how do you make something that's difficult accessible to people so they can understand it in a way that doesn't intimidate them. And then the part of me that's an academic wanted, like, how do you engage with really deep, complex ideas? And for me, the kind of Israel Palestine part of it is that's just my existence as a human being is living the kind of complexity of all the different forces and ideas that are happening in that. So I feel like you know my background kind of all came together in this one piece, and I directed a bunch of theater when I was in college. It was really interesting to me. I really look up to directors like Mike Lee, who works in a lot of what he does is he writes out of rehearsal. He rehearses scripts with actors, and then he'll revise based on what comes out of rehearsals, because they come up with stuff. So I think the fluidity of that process, the looseness of that process was really interesting to me, because being a film director is all about control. You have to really control the outcome. And something about this process felt a lot looser, because we had 10 days and we had to make a movie in 10 days. And so there's not a lot, you can't control everything.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious, it would have been really easy to make a documentary or a traditional biopic about Juliano. I'm curious, at what point during the process of coming up with this movie, writing this movie, did you realize that it had to be told this way in order to get your message across?
Well, if you think about it, Giuliano is kind of performing all of these different versions of himself at different times, right? And his identity is kind of is fractured by all of these performances that he has to negotiate. And that's not to say that who he was inauthentic. It's to say that I don't think there's any version of identity or understanding yourself that doesn't have some kind of performance to it, where you're kind of putting on the show of yourself as a podcaster, or yourself as a husband, or yourself as a child, or whatever that is. And so it's hard to tell when you're performing a version of yourself and negotiating different versions of yourself. Sometimes it's hard to tell, even for you, is this part of the performance, or is this really who I am? Is this the show, or is this something authentic? Is this the front stage, or is this the backstage, right? Is this and so the kind of the fluidity between those things and blurring those boundaries is really essential to this narrative, or this allegory about Giuliano. And so how do you take the fluidity and the blurriness of the boundaries and the instability between these things that you hope are very solid, and not only make it the content of the film, but also reflected in the kind of form of the film, right? In the film making itself. And so that's when we started to think about, well, what if we establish all these different frames of there's the stuff that they're watching on a screen, and then there's them rehearsing those scenes, and then there's them as actors trying to rehearse those scenes, but then there's them working with the director, and then there's me as a director working with the director who is an actor, right? So it's like all of a sudden you're creating all of these different little realms, and you can't really tell, which realm am I in? Am I in the realm of performance, or am I in the realm of backstage? There were times when Braxton and Sarah and I would look at each other during takes, and we didn't know, like, are they really fighting? Should we step in here because this is kind of getting weird, or are they performing fighting? Like, are they performing fighting or fighting? So the fact that we couldn't tell, I think, speaks to like the effectiveness of this blurring between people, and even between the three actors. Like we cast three actors that kind of looked the same. They were Middle Eastern, they had beards. Maybe you would confuse them if you saw them in a lineup, but we wanted you to confuse them. Like it was like a shell game. It's like, who am I, who am I looking at now? Like, is the shell over here? Is it over here? Like, where is the coin? Which shell is it under? And I think that's the feeling that I wanted to try to present for the audience, is that kind of confusion. When people say to me like, man, I liked your film, but it was really confusing, my reaction is immediately like, okay, you got it then.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I agree. Like there was multiple times during the film where I was like, my head was spinning a little bit, and I think also just in the back of my head, I was just like, what is the actual film process, and what is like, where does the acting stop and all of that? And
there's times I couldn't tell you. There's times that because really, think about it, there are times in the film, like, there are times in the film where people are asking and talking about like, is the accent too much? Is it like a cartoon?
Yeah.
Like, should I turn it down? Those are real conversations happening between real humans that are really actors who are playing actors, in it, what I mean? So it's almost like it's a hall of mirrors. It's like so I think that to me was the wonderful part about it, is you've got actors talking about acting, but they're also acting as actors, right?
Yeah.
And so those are real moments, but they're very relevant. What's the accent? Or at the end when in the final monologue, Kareem asks me before the take, he's like, do you think I should do this with an accent or no accent? Like, I don't know, because do I drop it? Like, that's a real conversation happening between Kareem and I, but it's also very effective for the concept of like this identity. Like, does this identity need an accent? Where are we with this? I think that's the kind of stuff that you really don't know. Where does it start? Where does it begin?
Yeah. And as you mentioned, 240 hours, right? You had captured
250 hours, yeah.
250 hours.
A lot.
I imagine that was very daunting, because I feel like there's a lot of nuance here.
Endless.
Yeah.
Endless. I would say almost a 2.5 year process of editing, maybe longer. Yeah, it was very hard. The first step was to try to cut together the script as it had been written. But even before that, just logging the footage was a months long thing. And the funny thing is that my editor, I decided to be my editor's assistant editor, because I wanted to log the footage, because nobody else could tell if like there's something that happened on set where Kareem turned in a certain way, or Musa, stepped across the stage in a certain way. And I thought, like, at the time I thought, oh my God, that's perfect. I'm the only one who would have been able to know that. So I was the one who did most of the logging of the footage and just organizing it, so that we could start with a paper edit of like, where in the script, where do we have this take of this line? How many versions of it do we have? Let's organize them so we can just look at them and then just pick what's best and what isn't. So just that in its own, I think that took like 6 months, that took a really long time.
Not to mention that
and then trying to, do an assembly.
Oh, not to mention that you also incorporate like actual footage of Juliano's films and his life in there as well.
Totally. And it's like that's like, well, where are we going to do that? So I think that part of it was very, very unwieldy for a really long time. But, we made an assembly of the script as it had been written originally, in the order that it had been written originally. And of course, like, we watched it and we were like, no, that's not it. That's not the movie. Now let's start to move it around and make it nonlinear, and let's get rid of stuff and let's compress. And at the end of the process, I will tell you, and I think this is a real compliment to Ben Shern and Alex Tyson, our editors, uh, this is exactly the film that I wanted to make, but not at all the film that I wrote. I mean, it's very different than the script that I wrote, but it is exactly what I ended up wanting to make. So I didn't want to make, there's nothing I would want to change about it, except maybe I'd love to get another 10 or 12 minutes out of it. It still feels like a really dense, dialogue heavy, talky film, but I'm really pleased with where we ended up.
Yeah, and I feel like the possibilities are probably endless, right? You could
I could cut
tweak forever.
Films. Yeah, I literally could, on the drives that I have of all of the footage, there's probably 3 different features in there I could find. I don't want to. I'm over it. I want to move on to the next thing, but I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I could only imagine.
Yeah. I don't even get to see.
Yeah. So you've worked in both inside the film industry and in more experimental and academic spaces. What advice would you give to young filmmakers trying to find their own voice right now?
Well, I think this is kind of the revelation that I had making this film, which is I'm trying to negotiate, like, what do I think about this conflict? Like, where do I stand in this situation with all these different sides? And the most honest thing that I could come up with is like, I'm having a hard time figuring that out. So the subject of the film becomes the hard time that I'm having figuring out which position I occupy. And I think that is something that I think is the kind of most honest way of going about things, is if you don't know how you feel about a particular idea or a subject or a world or a story world, then make a movie about not knowing it. Don't make a movie that pretends like you do know. That was kind of revelatory for me, because it became not about like, oh, I have to say something definitive. It was really hard for me. I was in a graduate program. I was studying Israel and Palestine and the history. And it was like, I was trying to figure out, what am I going to write as a dissertation? Like, what do I have to say? And what right do I have to say anything about this? So figuring out how to kind of speak something about an issue like this, which is, really tense and can be very offensive. You can offend people very easily. Trying to figure out what to say was really hard. So as a filmmaker and not as an academic, I could at least deal with it a little bit more poetically and deal with my confusion or deal with my conflicts, internal conflict, right? Juliano is a perfect figure for that, right? Because he himself was conflicted at different parts of his life about this identity.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering that. I was wondering if this was almost your way of processing everything and kind of trying to
absolutely. I mean, I'm
grapple
not
with
Juliano,
answers,
right? Because
yeah,
this guy is a legitimate, I think, activist in the sense that he was risking his life to do the things that he was doing, and that was a part of my thought process. We're talking about this movie was being written around probably during COVID, right? So I'm kind of reading about Juliano and thinking like, wow, look at this guy. He's actually really doing something in the world. This activism is really impressive. And like, do I have it in me to risk my life for something that I, care passionately about? So it was a way of kind of processing my difficulty in understanding these kind of contradictory feelings, and also figuring out how to say something about that, right? And to be able to just say like, okay, I don't have an answer. What I'm saying is that I don't have an answer, but I can at least introduce you to why I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's hard for audiences to accept. They want to know, what is your answer? And even in the process of making this film, we were confronted constantly by people even working on the film who were looking for answers that we didn't have, because we didn't want to have answers because we didn't have them, right? We didn't want to make them up.
It gave me a bunch of things to think about after walking away from
it, right? Like most people aren't even thinking about those things. So it's very useful that you can now go away and be like, okay, well, I know more about it, but I don't have an answer. I think that's more honest than like, oh, I know who's right and I know who's wrong. I think to me, that is often problematic, because it requires you to repress and erase a lot of other information so that you can come up with an answer that sounds like it's a clear answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the last question I have for you, and it's a bit personal for me. I once met a filmmaker in a bar in Paris, and we were talking, and he eventually ended up recommending the movie Paris, Texas to me. He said it was the movie that made him fall in love with cinema, and from that moment on, he knew he was going to become a director. Went home, watched the movie, loved that movie. I'm wondering, do you have a film that made you, I don't know, was like the moment where the light bulb went off and said, I want to do film for the rest of my life? Or was there a director or a moment that
I have
happened for you?
that moment or experience every few years, right? But when I was a kid, it was like, watching a Steven Spielberg movie or like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I was like, oh my God, like, what is this? But I'd say, the older that I get, the more interested I am in films that are kind of difficult and complex and nuanced. And so the two movies that I'm constantly going back to these days are Charlie Kaufman's Synecdoche, New York, and a movie that was made probably in the 90s that was called Suture, right? Which was a black and white film made by a couple of UC Berkeley PhD students who went on to make, other films after that, but really a complex, difficult film about identity and the way that we, that we accept certain things about identity. So I think those two films are the two films that I point to more and more often these days, because they just mess you up. They don't leave you with a lot of answers, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's great when a movie can do that. Like you just walk away feeling like you've been punched in the gut.
Yeah. Well, I can see how that was maybe influenced a little bit here as well.
Yeah.
I've tried to explain this movie to friends after I watched it, and it's not a simple movie to explain in a quick process.
Yeah. Which is not, it's not, that's why I think it's it's absolutely, it's not a commercial film, because there's no log line for it.
Yeah.
It's like very hard to express it, but I'm okay with that, because I'm making a film that I would want to see, that will appeal hopefully to people who have the same kind of appreciation that I do. And I don't know that there's a lot of people like that, but I would love it if a lot of people saw this film and could.
Yeah. Well, it's an awesome film. It's Yes, Repeat, No. You can rent it on Amazon and Apple TV, bought on DVD as well. Michael, thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I love the film.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing me on.